University of Pennsylvania with Professor Tom Mallouk. You know, I like Philadelphia a lot. I like to include pictures in my slides. So, you know, here's Philadelphia throughout the seasons. And like you said, I'm going to be talking today about acoustic propulsion of nanorods. But more generally, I also want to kind of describe acoustics in general. It's a complex and relatively new part of microswimmers and active matter. And I think it's really important to kind of outline the theory and a little bit more about how you use them in general, more than just focusing on this one topic. So of course, you know, when we want to get motivated, we have to think about why we want to study acoustic propulsion in general. We already have so many great ways of propelling different types of swimmers via chemical power, magnetic power, things like that. And definitely one of the biggest prospects is in biomedicine, because acoustics are already very mature and clinically relevant. You know, there's already been multiple demonstrations of acoustically powered motors for biomedical applications, but also you can get incredible images like this one from various types of ultrasound diagnostics and things like that. And so if you can come up with good biomedical applications, the translation seems obvious. But even more than that, especially what my boss Tom likes to focus on, are kind of the fundamental applications or the fundamental science and what we can learn from these things. So first of all, you know, I'll talk about, you know, bimetallic nanorods swim at acoustic fields. And for a while, this really stumped us, but it allowed us to learn a lot about ultrasound matter interactions and how these things work. And beyond that too, it's another interesting way that we can maybe create self-organized systems that have interesting properties. You know, again, we already have seen this with magnetics and chemical power. So how can we apply this as well to acoustics? And again, just to start off, I want to kind of dive into the theory so that people understand a little bit more what we're doing here. And basically, the way to think about an acoustic wave, sound wave in general, is like a pressure wave. So much like a light wave is an electromagnetic wave with crests of let's say electric and magnetic fields pointed in opposite directions. An acoustic field is kind of a pressure wave. So you can imagine some ambient pressure that you're sitting at. And when you apply an acoustic wave, you see an increase and decrease in pressure at the respective crests of this wave. And one of the examples I really like to include are, for example, bubbles. How might this have an effect on the environment? And the way you can think about this is if you have a bubble sitting in a solution or anything like that, at ambient pressure, it's going to be some static size. But at the peaks, at the positive peaks of these waves, you're going to get an increase in pressure that decreases the volume of the bubble, like by applying pressure. And at the negative crests, you're going to actually get an increase in volume because the bubble's now feeling a negative pressure. And in general, we do these types of experiments in acoustic cavities. So for example, if we usually use silicon wafers with a piezoelectric chip epoxied to the bottom. The piezoelectric is made of something like lead zirconate titanate that actually changes its volume in the direction of these electrodes when you apply a potential. So basically, by applying a sine wave potential of the same frequency, we're able to achieve sound waves of some desired frequency. And then a lot of the experiments I'll be showing today are done at acoustic standing waves, which means that if you make a cavity with a piezoelectric and some sort of reflector, usually just a regular glass slide, and you meet the half wave condition of this cavity of height h. By applying an acoustic wave at half the wavelength of the cavity height, you're able to establish an acoustic standing wave. And typically things that are perfectly symmetric will just go to the area of lowest pressure and levitate at the point between the glass slide and the silicon wafer. But where things started to get really interesting, and basically where this kind of area of research was born, of course, Tony Wong has been doing a lot of microfluidic based acoustic experiments for a while, but nobody really made a micro swimmer before 2013, where we kind of discovered that these bimetallic rods swim at acoustic pressure nodes. And again, this really stumped us, and we had no idea what was going on, and we really wanted to explore it further. So just in general, before I start getting really into the micro rod stuff, I wanted to talk about acoustic propulsion in general. Based on what I just told you, there's two types of acoustic propulsion that are really possible. The first one is with traveling waves, which means you kind of ignore what I told you most recently with the standing waves. And these are microswimmers that can be powered just by applying a traveling acoustic field. So like one example are these asymmetric bubble swimmers, where you have this asymmetric cavity in which you've trapped a bubble, and this generates acoustic streaming or fluid flow out of the open end of the bubble. And then there's also been one single example of a swimmer with a flexible tail, where the theory is that the oscillations from the acoustic waves vibrate the rod and kind of cause this sperming type motion. And then, of course, you can have acoustic standing waves where with free bodies, basically you start vibrating things that have high density. And so if you have some free body at an acoustic standing wave, it's going to oscillate up and down. And these oscillations are going to drive fluid flow that can be used to drive propulsion. There's also a lot of work with surface structures that can generate fluid flow. And again, this is kind of vibration of these structures at ultra high speeds that's able to drive fluid flow around sharp edges, for example. And then what I'll really talk about today are these asymmetric bimetallic rods that we have a nice working theory, I think, for why they are actually Purcell motors, kind of like sperm. And if you had to break them down, I would say that that traveling wave propelled swimmers are much more relevant for biomedical applications and things like that, because really you'll never establish an acoustic standing wave inside somebody's body. We need to get away from that idea if we're talking about biomedical applications. Really, bubble swimmers in that respect, I think, are the best things to think about. They will work at really, really low acoustic powers, and so that makes them very biomedically relevant. But it doesn't mean that acoustic standing wave propulsion is any less valuable. We can learn a lot about physics and microfluidics and all sorts of different things by studying interactions at these setups. So again, just to talk a little bit more broadly, I'll talk a little bit about our work on bubble propelled motors. These have actually been created before. We're not the first people to do it, but we were really excited to see these really novel properties from a very simplistic design. And the way that we make these is through nanoscribing. So a nanoscribe is a 2-photon polymerization laser system that's able to 3D print at the micro and nano scale. So what we're able to do is define the shape of this cavity with some SU8 type polymer. We add a layer of nickel to make this thing magnetic. In real applications, when we started this, we skipped this gold layer, but then actually the buoyancy of the bubble overcame the density of the cavity itself, and these things floated. And we didn't want them to float, we wanted them to sink. So we actually added about 40 nanometers of gold to the outside to make them dense enough to sink to the bottom of our chambers and things like that. And that worked out pretty well. And then by adding a hydrophobic layer to the outside of the cavity, we're able to basically trap a gas bubble because we make the shell so hydrophobic that water is not able to get inside when you take them from air and put them in water. And the thing that really excited us when we first tried to use these things is when you turn on the acoustic field, they immediately stand up. They stand up kind of to attention. And then from there, you can use the nickel layer and a strong magnet to propel them in different directions. And this is something that nobody had really seen before with these types of swimmers, but it makes them really powerful and modular. You can kind of tell them to go wherever you want them to go, and they can turn on a dime, right? So they're already up straight, and you can tell them where to go with high precision. And basically the way you can think about this phenomenon is, it's a little complicated, but basically we know that two bubbles in an acoustic field are attracted to each other because of mutual scattering. So they scatter acoustic waves off of their surface, and when they scatter in synchronous, they're attracted to each other. Here, there's only one bubble, but it's so close to a strongly reflective surface, it actually sees an acoustic image of itself in the substrate. So this is like if you looked at a mirror and saw yourself, this thing looks in the substrate and sees an acoustic reflection. Because it's attracted to its own reflection, that exerts a torque, and the end of this bubble wants to be as close to the substrate as possible. What that results in is the motor standing up like this. And then when you apply a magnetic field, you can tilt it in one direction and get it to swim in that direction. I get this question a lot. You know, actually, if you think about this more logically, it doesn't seem to make sense, because actually the bubble is just expanding and contracting, which is totally reciprocal. So actually, I get this question a lot, like, how does this even work at low Reynolds number? And actually, the answer is because in the megahertz oscillation regime, the bubble interface is moving so fast that it actually, the Reynolds number is no longer much less than 1. And you actually start hitting this regime where reciprocal motion does give you directional fluid flow. So I think that's really interesting and kind of a cool idea in general. But you know, besides the fact that it's attracted to its own reflection, that also makes it attracted to any solid object, not just the substrate. And that makes it really powerful, because that means you can actually go up to objects, pick them up with this attractive force, and move them to new locations in order to pattern objects and things like that. And of course, as well, you know, they're attracted to all solid objects. So if we build this little staircase for our swimmers, they're able to climb the staircase really nicely. They can traverse not only the flat parts, but also the walls. And here as well, we also wanted them to swim in 3 dimensions. And actually, they're too close to the substrate to overcome this force that's called the Birkness force. I forgot to mention that. But if you add these little legs to the swimmer, that adds enough space between the substrate and the bubble to break this force and move the swimmer in a 3rd dimension. This was really exciting. But one of the questions we got a lot is, how much smaller can you make these? I should mention that they're about 8 microns long and 5 microns wide. And a lot of people were thinking about how we could move them through capillaries in blood vessels and things like that. And for that, you need to be probably below 2 or 1 micron. But the problem is, when we used the nanoscribe to define these things, we're very limited to the diffraction limit of light. And that really limited how small we could make these things. So this is when I kind of picked up the project, and I started thinking a lot about how we can get around this problem of the diffraction limit. And what I eventually settled on was kind of rigging up some techniques from our lab in the past. And what you can do is you can spin coat some polystyrene spheres on a silicon wafer, and then you can evaporate some chromium over top of the polystyrene, and then dissolve the polystyrene spheres, so you're left with these little holes on a chromium mask. And when you etch the silicon wafer through these holes, you can generate these holes. You can use ALD to fill the holes with some material. You can etch the silicon away again, add a magnetic coating, and then make these things hydrophobic with a perfluoroalkylsilane. And I was really happy with how well this worked. So now the size of the swimmer is only based on the size of the polystyrene particle that you're able to template onto the surface, where the possibilities are basically endless. You could go down to 10 nanometers if you wanted to, or all the way up to 20, 30 microns. And this is also much more high throughput. So now you don't have to print on a tiny chip. You could do this on a 4-inch wafer and make millions or billions of swimmers at a time. So in this set of experiments, we went all the way from 5 microns down to 500 nanometers. And one of the really interesting things that we started to notice was not only do these things behave a lot like their predecessors, but also, through sweeping the frequency and trying to find where these things oscillate, we also discovered these kind of sub-resonant and hyper-resonant modes that allow them to swim in interesting ways. So not only now can they swim near the surface, down to the surface, but they can also swim away from the surface at different frequencies that allows you to kind of tune their interactions with their environment. And what would be really important for biomedical applications, in my opinion, would be this type of research where now you can get them to swim freely in some medium. Before, actually, because they stood up, you needed a magnetic field to direct them in some way. But now that they can swim freely, that opens up a lot of possibilities for swimming around in different environments autonomously. And perhaps you can direct them to some environment that you want them to be in. But yeah, again, what I'm really here to talk about today are nanorods. So, I'd be happy to talk more if anybody has any questions. But right, the topic today is more about nanorods. So really the way to think about this problem, again, we for a while we had no idea why these things swam. But there's two things to consider in terms of these things' interactions with acoustic fields. The first is kind of shape asymmetry. So when we make these nanorods and nanoporous templates, they're not automatically perfectly symmetric. They're not perfect cylinders. They always have a concave and a convex end, which adds a little shape asymmetry to their structure. But also they have compositional and density asymmetry. So if I have a rhodium gold rod, the rhodium's density and other metals like ruthenium, silver, nickel, they all have densities between 8 and 13 grams per cubic centimeter. But gold has a density much higher, around 19 grams per cubic centimeter. And so we did a bunch of different experiments to figure out why these things swim the way that they do. And what we found is that gold rods, or even gold platinum rods, where gold and platinum are very close in density, those things always swim with their concave edge forward. You can see this in the microscope. They always swim with their concave edge forward. But if you start to add density asymmetry, the density asymmetry always leads. It always dominates this effect. So if I have a gold ruthenium rod, it always is propelled with its ruthenium end forward. If you make them gold rhodium, again, rhodium and ruthenium have very similar densities, you always get the lighter end of the rod leading. That's always the end that goes forward first. Even if you add some shape asymmetry, you still get the same propulsion direction, or you still get the same phenomenal direction. And again, our host, he actually did most of these original experiments, and he also did this set of experiments that really showed that shape has a large role to play. Where first of all, we see a lot of this orbiting type behavior, and we think now that comes from these very asymmetric rods that have deformities or some sort of bending. But also, he was able to make these very symmetric rods that did not propel at all. So they're single component, they're only silver, and they displayed no directional propulsion, which means that shape here plays a large role. I actually also added this at the last minute during the last speaker's talk, kind of how you can also apply these types of ideas to acoustics and microfluidics. So there was another recent paper from our lab from the student that mentored me, where you can actually combine acoustics and microfluidics to get what's called rheotaxis. So rheotaxis is directional swimming due to fluid flow. So what we're actually able to do here is combine chemistry and acoustics. So the chemistry of these nanorods actually forces them to be attracted. One end of this rod is attracted to the substrate. When you apply some shear flow, that forces the rod to take one orientation. And then when you apply a surface acoustic standing wave, the rods not only align themselves with the acoustic field when you apply flow, or they not only align themselves with flow when you apply flow, but then when you apply an acoustic field, they all go in the same direction because they all have the same directionality of their density asymmetry. So right, let's get down to it. Why do these things swim at all? There's a bunch of different theories that talk about both shape and density asymmetry, but we'll start with shape. So one of the kind of easy ways to think about this is if you just have a sphere in an acoustic standing wave, it's going to generate fluid flow. Again, it's actually oscillating up and down as it's being hit by acoustic waves. And that's going to generate this acoustic streaming. Around a totally symmetric object, the streaming flows kind of cancel each other out, and you get no type of swimming or anything like that. But as soon as you institute any sort of shape asymmetry, you're going to break the symmetry of these streaming modes, and you're going to get directional propulsion. So, you know, this theory paper is very complicated and complex, but the important takeaway is that asymmetry in shape generates asymmetry in streaming, which leads to directional motion. And then moving on to density, there's a lot of different theoretical papers that basically suggest that if you have some density asymmetry, interactions with acoustic fields are very much governed by the density of a material. And the basic idea is that if I have a gold ruthenium rod and I force it to oscillate in an acoustic field, one end is going to oscillate at a higher amplitude than the other. And this also will generate asymmetric acoustic streaming. These ideas have been explored in multiple different ways. There's a really nice recent paper from Joe Wong where he and his students, they took silica particles and they added different thicknesses of dense metals to one end and forced them to swim. So you can see as you make this thing more asymmetric by adding more material, the swimming speed goes up. And as you increase the density of the material that you deposit, the speed also goes up as well. So this adds a lot of emphasis to this theory here, where increasing the density asymmetry might lead to some increase in speed. And so we actually started this project before he published that paper. But either way, the answer turned out to be very, very nice. So our idea, trying to look at this mechanism here, was to make 3 types of nanorods. We're going to call them type A, type B, and type C. Man, I'm running a little low on time. And basically, the thought process here is as you move the stripe down this ruthenium nanorod, you're going to decrease the density asymmetry of this rod. So this one is very density asymmetric. This one, you're starting to balance the density asymmetry, and then this one should be totally balanced. And so what we saw at first was this really nice trend where as you move the stripe down the rod, it gets faster and faster. So type C with the stripe in the middle has very low speed, where type A has the fastest speed. But we really started to think about how do we even know that these results are real, because we don't ever calibrate our acoustic field. And we started to think about how important it is to know exactly how strong your acoustic field is to generate the propulsion you're seeing. Where, you know, in all of these papers, people are making a lot of assumptions about how strong their acoustic field is, and they're never actually calibrating it. So the way that we did this is we took silica particles and we levitated them to an acoustic pressure node. And what you can see is that all of these spheres have this little halo around them. And actually, by calibrating the height of the particle as a function of its halo diameter of the diameter of this ring, you're actually able to figure out how high it goes and track its speed as it goes up to the acoustic levitation point. And because it has some drag force and some density, you can figure out what the force of the acoustic field is based on how fast it rises. And what we see is this really nice trend as we increase the strength of the acoustic field, and we know the strength of the acoustic field, we can see this nice trend in how fast our rods are moving. But what we saw when we actually calibrated the acoustic field is when you compare all of the theories that we've seen before, they're all, this is a log scale here, they're all an order of magnitude or more off from the real swimming speeds. And so that really sent us back to the drawing board. And basically there were no theories that matched the trends we were seeing. And our theorist had kind of a crazy idea where he asked me to make rods with different aspect ratios. So we went all the way from a 1-to-1 aspect ratio up to really large aspect ratios. And this required me to synthesize 6 new types of nanorods with various aspect ratios. I measured the speed and amplitude of every acoustic field at 6 field strengths. I repeated these experiments 3 times at 3 different frequency ranges, and that added up to a total of 126 silica particles tracked to calibrate the acoustic field at every single experiment, and over 126 videos analyzed for global swimming speed. But when I did this, it really started to come into focus how we were able to develop a new theory to explain the trends that we were seeing. I would also like to add that none of this would have been possible without Mosaic Suite in ImageJ. I actually talked to the creators, and they incorporated GPU and accelerated image processing for me because this was so slow. So processing by tracking different rods by hand or with the normal Mosaic Suite, which is a particle tracking algorithm, that took about 1 to 2 hours, even using your computer to do auto tracking. But by adding GPU acceleration, you can do the same process in about 15 minutes. So I was so happy with it. I just wanted to plug it. If anybody wants to give it a try, it's really fantastic. So what did we settle on? Again, kind of the initially proposed mechanism in a lot of these situations is this idea that the rod kind of oscillates up and down asymmetrically. But via these experiments where we varied the aspect ratio, we really settled on this mechanism where the rod actually kind of swims like a sperm. And the reason is because you have some, basically you have a rod that has shape asymmetry, or it has some shape. It has a geometrical center, and it has a center of gravity. And those two things are not coincident with each other. So if you have a bimetallic rod, the center of symmetry is here, but the center of gravity is over here. And basically what that leads to is this kind of rod that not only changes its position, but it not only changes orientation, but also its position in space. And that allows it to actually kind of oscillate up and down, not just, so here, people were suggesting that they just changed their orientation, but they also changed their position. And basically the theory here is that if you have a difference in, if you have a difference between the drag coefficients of the ends of the rod, so this is basically what you're seeing here is the difference between the transverse drag coefficient and the parallel drag coefficient. And what that leads to is when you have very small differences, this V prop goes to 0. And when you have very large differences, this V prop goes way up. So what you see is that at very low aspect ratios where the transverse and parallel drag coefficients are very close to one another, the V prop is very low. And as you increase the asymmetry, as you increase the aspect ratio, your numbers start to go up. They reach some crest, and then they actually start to come back down again because you're actually adding drag to the rod. So the longer the rod is, the more hydrodynamic drag there is at some critical length, and you actually start to lose propulsion speed. Of course, I will admit that our trends aren't perfect. They don't perfectly match the theory. The green one is probably the best, but we were really excited because this involves no adjustable parameters. So I want to explain that the big takeaway here is that we think that these rods basically sperm, but we are also not saying that acoustic streaming plays no role. We know that from all these previous experiments and also from shape asymmetry, that acoustic streaming definitely plays a role. And so we're thinking that some of the differences in our between our theory and our experiment are driven by the coupling between our mechanism and acoustic streaming. So I just kind of want to highlight what we learned from these experiments. First of all, if you're going to do experiments where you're trying to suss out a mechanism acoustically, you really need to calibrate your acoustic fields. It turns out that we were way off in a lot of our assumptions about the acoustic field strength. And and nothing that I'm showing here would be possible without knowing exactly the acoustic field strength at every measurement. So this is a really important aspect of these experiments. The other thing is that we kind of defined this really new swimming mechanism between coupling of ultrasound and matter. And we're really excited to think about how we might be able to leverage this for different types of applications. You know, I talked earlier about different types of flagellar swimmers. Perhaps you might be able to couple strong oscillations of the body to some flexible flagella that increases the speed. We're still studying a couple of different possibilities there. But it also, now that we have a theory for why this works, rational design is much more possible. So if you want to create the fastest swimmer for your application, you now know that you can't make it too short, but you also can't make it too long. We've kind of defined this optimal aspect ratio that people might be able to use to design the fastest and best swimmers. So with that, I'll wrap up my talk. I need to acknowledge all the people that funded the research, University of Pennsylvania, the Center for Nanotechnology here, a lot of our funding from the NSF and the LRSM, and also all the people that helped me do the work, my lab, and all of our collaborators. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Very interesting research.